my name is Anna Escamilla.
My name is Sarah Ort.
And I'm Kennedy Siemens, and we are going to be talking about systems theory today.
Systems theory states that behavior is influenced by a variety of factors that work together as a system. A person's parents, friends, school, economic class, home environment, and other factors all influence how a person thinks and acts. Seeking to help correct missing or ineffective parts of that system can have a positive impact on behavior. The reverse, of course, is also true.
So systems theory has a lot of difference in the history of it. There's a lot of different people that had a lot of different effects on the theory itself, but it was really rooted in sociology and biology. And Ferdinand Tönnies, Emile Durkheim, and Henry Maine were pretty much the main sociologists that kind of started this little movement. They were macro sociologists, and they were very their core belief was that many social behaviors were all affected by different social systems. And so that's kind of where we kind of see a lot of this beginning of looking at systems, but they weren't really describing them as systems. They were looking at them as just different societies. And then George Homans came in on more of a micro level, and he started to kind of apply this society theory that Tönnies, Durkheim, and Maine began, and looking at it more of a personal perspective. So he was applying it to smaller groups. And the biological system that we see also has a really big tie into this. And that's kind of where we see the ecological perspective in that way. So we're looking in the biological systems a lot more at, how different systems and ecosystems in our world are affected by minor changes, major changes, and how that affects everybody else in the biological system. So looking at things like when one species goes extinct and how that affects the rest of the environment, or a drought and how that affects, maybe the birth rates of some animals or the death rates of different vegetation, and how that continuously has effects for the rest of the world. And then the Ludwig von Bertalanffy in the 1920s kind of started creating our version of what we know as general systems theory, or the dynamic systems theory as the contemporary version. So he characterized a need for more emphasis on change, growth, creativity, and transformation in the human systems. So he was kind of looking at it more, not so just the typical way that people and things were related, but more so on all of the different ways that systems in general were related, and like the ways that they change and transform together. And then Gordon Hearn kind of introduced us to what we know general systems theory today, and that's more of dynamic systems theory. And he really helped kind of introduce social workers to what we're talking about. So he really thought, the way that systems theory was founded and created, that really has a lot of roots and value for the social work field, and looking at a more of a holistic approach in our interventions and when we're working with clients, just listening to clients and then informing those interventions. And he, kind of introduced that to the profession in the late 70s. So our textbook that we've been using this semester has kind of described systems theory as an all-encompassing 5 different theories in that, which is the structural functionalism, dynamic systems theory, deep ecology, ecofeminism, and then the ecological perspective. But today we're just going to be focusing more on dynamic systems theory, or what we also may know it as is general systems theory.
Okay, so there's a few basic tenets of systems theory. Basically, social systems theory consists of a complex arrangement of elements, which includes both the individual and their beliefs. There are like 3 different classifications of these for what we basically know today, and that's micro, meso, and macro. So micro would be like your direct relationships. Meso would be kind of like larger organizations, communities, political parties, like the graph says. And then macro would be things that maybe aren't as easily seen. So legal systems, like culture, things of that sort. But basically, systems theory acknowledges that social, cultural, and economic conditions directly affect a person and how they live their life.
Our group identified Nicole, Alyssa, Wanda, Dorothy, Marquise, and Terrell, all as members of the Collins family. Nicole was the narrator of the film. Nicole attended high school at Henry Horner, and she was very successful there. Nicole was extremely committed to her success, and while in high school, she was involved with the Boys and Girls Club. As a result of her commitment and involvement in the Boys and Girls Club, Nicole gained a mentor, Kenny Butler. Kenny was able to assist Nicole in finding employment and applying for financial aid. Nicole was the first high school graduate in her family, and after graduation, Nicole was accepted and attended Northern Illinois University, where she majored in early childhood development. While she was in college, Nicole met Johnny Pierre, and she later married him. Nicole had several systems present in her life, micro, meso, and macro levels. Nicole was motivated and a successful young woman, but her family system could have influenced that. Nicole's family systems included her mother, grandmother, siblings, and Terrell. Nicole's mother was a motivator for her, and due to her mother not graduating from high school, Nicole saw this as a motivation and further pushed her to graduate. Nicole also knew that if she did not get an education, there was a chance that she may never get out of the project. Her grandmother and mother were still in the project, and she saw how unhappy they were, and she did not want that for herself. Terrell's death was a motivator for Nicole. Nicole said, "Terrell left us with something good, something very powerful. He's shown us how precious life is. He's left us with a spirit to not just accept what we have, but to struggle for more. He was motivated to us to believe in ourselves and make something of ourselves." If Terrell had not died, Nicole would have still been motivated, but maybe not as much as she is now. Nicole grew up without a father figure in her life, and during Nicole's involvement with the Boys and Girls Club, she got to know Kenny. Kenny was a mentor and further provided Nicole with encouragement and motivation. Kenny assisted Nicole with finding employment and applying for financial aid. Without the Boys and Girls Club, Nicole may have never met Kenny and may have not gotten that support and assistance she needed. The macro systems that affected Nicole's life are poverty and location, and both of these systems moved how she succeeded in her life.
Okay, and now on to Wanda. So Wanda was Nicole's aunt. She suffered from an addiction to cocaine. She had her first child when she was 15 and then had 5 more after that. Terrell was actually Wanda's second oldest child, and he was shot and killed while walking home from school, or walking home from a friend's house, sorry. And then due to her inability to keep a job, her children were looked after by her mother. She had sought treatment for addiction and was able to overcome it, even though it did take quite a few times. She got a maintenance job working at the projects. And then eventually she was able to save up money to buy her own apartment for her and her children. And then as for Wanda's systems, so she has her micro system, and these were the things that were most important to her. So one big portion for the very beginning part of the movie was her addiction to drugs. It pretty much was something that she woke up every day to do and lived for. So it was very, very important to her. As for her children and Terrell, the death of Terrell really affected her and eventually is what drove her to get clean. Her maintenance job, she talked a lot about how if she had a job, she could feel a sense of purpose and she could feel like she was getting up every day to do something besides just taking care of her kids. So getting that job was super, super important for her and helped her out in the long run. As for the meso system, she has public aid. So before she wasn't working, so she needed aid pretty much to live her whole life. Like she didn't have any means of income. And she was able to get off that eventually. She had Haymarket, which was her addiction program that she went through. And she talked a lot about how that was a huge role in her kind of pulling herself up by her bootstraps and getting a start on life. And then as for her macro system, I have poverty and location. Again, being on public aid, she didn't really have any money. And then location, being in a place where the culture of drugs was so prevalent. And then also gun violence when it came to her own son. So those are what I have for Wanda.
Dorothy was Alyssa and Wanda's mother, and she raised Wanda's children as Wanda was experiencing and working through her addiction. Dorothy lived in the projects and has lived in poverty for a long time, but was eventually able to overcome that and move out of the projects. And she has always wanted to break that cycle. Due to her work in the library and after-school program at St. Malachi, her grandchildren were able to get a decent education. When Dorothy's grandson Terrell was killed, it shook her family. And due to the media coverage of Terrell's death, a $10,000 donation was anonymously donated to the family, and Dorothy knew that she wanted to use that money to get out of the projects. 4 years later, Dorothy received help from a home construction project for low-income families, and with the help of the project and the $10,000, Dorothy was able to purchase a home. The home was built for her family, and Dorothy moved in before the home was completely finished. They moved in just in time to celebrate Christmas in their new home. Along with all of the other family members mentioned so far, Dorothy has several systems in place in her life. Her microsystems include her family, which include Wanda's addiction and Terrell's death. And Dorothy is a great example of intergenerational parenting. So if Dorothy did not take on the task of raising her grandchildren would not maybe be as successful or in the same place as they are right now. Dorothy also had to push herself to find better housing so she could support her grandchildren and keep them safe. Along with other family members, Terrell's death provided so much motivation to Dorothy. Dorothy pushed herself to do better as a result of his death. And the welfare system has been a major support for Dorothy and her family. Dorothy did not want to remain in the projects, and she wasn't always happy to be on welfare, but it was definitely something that benefited and helped their family. Along with welfare, the construction project for low-income families assisted Dorothy and her family to move out of the projects and into a safer environment for her family. And along with everybody else listed, she has poverty and location as her macro systems. Due to these things, her other mesosystems and microsystems have been affected.
Terrell was Nicole's cousin. He was Wanda's second oldest child. He was described as a smart kid who was later in the school, the community, and his family. He was a scholar student at St. Malachi Academy, which was a private high school, and he got into an argument with another kid after a basketball game, and then a week later, he was shot in the chest and the head while walking home from a friend's house, and he died at the age of 14. So Terrell was talked about mostly after his death, but from what I was able to see from when they were talking about his life, his microsystem consisted of his school peers, his cousins, his mother, and his grandmother. And again, his grandmother was the one who raised him because of his mother's addiction and inability to care for her children. As for the mesosystem, I have public aid and gun violence. So again, because his mother or his grandmother had gotten public aid, he benefited from that. And then gun violence, it was more of like a cultural thing, because again, in his area, there was like a decent amount of gun violence present, and that's ultimately how he lost his life. And then for his macro system, I have location and socioeconomic status, because again, he was somebody who benefited from public aid, and it really helped him and his family.
Okay, so looking at Elisa, we're looking at Nicole's mom, and she lives at Harry Horner along with Dorothy and Wanda and the children. Harry Horner is the project facility that they all live at. So Elisa is kind of theme throughout this. The documentary was talking about how much she wanted to get off of public aid. So she was a third generation in her family on public aid and really struggled with that as part of her identity. She was the first child, and she had her first child at 16 years old, and then she had 4 more after that. So due to her children that she dropped out of high school after the 11th grade to raise them, and she has been in and out of jobs ever since, but can never get far enough along in the process to be off of aid, which we see a lot based on policy issues. So she tries to get off of aid, but is unable to find the childcare that she needs to make sure that her kids are safe while she's at a job orientation. So that way, or because of this, she then misses the opportunity for the job orientation and then does not get the job. As well as some training. She is late to the training orientation one time, and she kind of has this attitude of like, I'll get there when I get there. And that's really based on a lot of fear that she has of, of change and not wanting to be a failure anymore. So it's kind of preventing her from being her most successful, just because she's so fearful and worried that she's going to fail her children and fail her family. Eventually, throughout the film, Nicole really inspires Elisa. You can tell she's really, really proud of Nicole, and she really works hard to get her GED, because she became a teacher at St. Malachi. She was, or St. Malachy, she was working at one of the classrooms for the kindergartner group, and one of the teachers went on maternity leave, and Elisa was offered the opportunity to take over for that teacher once she ended up not coming back. But she had to get her GED and then get her teaching certificate. And she really kind of, just blossomed after that, really worked hard to do that, because she just, saw this opportunity in front of her that she was really looking forward to. So her systems theories are really very similar to the rest of the family that we've been talking about. Her microsystem obviously is her kids, her mom and her sister that she's really close with, and all of her nieces and nephews. And then the mesosystem is really that welfare and public aid piece that we're seeing. So that's the child care that she needed was preventing her from the job opportunities. And then there's a lot of the policy loopholes that she was noticing that kept hindering that process and going farther and farther for her. And then we see her later on in the movie working a part-time job to, make sure she can make ends meet for the Christmas time for her kids, and not wanting to tell public aid because they would take her benefits away if she was, even though she was only making $6.25 an hour, I think it was. So we're really noticing that in her mesosystems, and then in her micro especially as well. As a single mother, she's really just trying to parent her kids well and keep her children safe and supported. You can tell she really cares about her children and wants them to be super loved, and wants to raise them to have better opportunities than she had, which is, in Nicole's case, she's really motivating her and helping her to kind of get out of the system that she's been stuck in and try to get her in a better life. And so she really wants to better herself. She ultimately will change her family's path once she becomes this, kindergartner teacher. She's going to be helping her children after that, her younger children, and working through those feelings of shame and guilt and failure. And so the macro system here, like we've been talking about, would be the poverty area that she's in, as well as the location that she's having to work in, because like we were all talking about, the gun violence that's there that really just, rocked her family's world, and how that has its lasting effects. So as a social worker, you want to take all of these into consideration, and when working with Elisa and like thinking about all of these systems that are intertwined with each other and how they're preventing something from happening here, and trying to work to get her to find the change that she so badly wants. And then that brings us to Jack. So Jack was walking home with Terrell when he was murdered, and he really blames himself for Terrell's death because he was the one that was with him at that basketball game that resulted in a fight with a friend from school. And Jack was the one that was in the fight with the school, and then Terrell was just with him, kind of seen as an accomplice, I guess, by the guy that was upset with them. And so Jack just really blamed himself. You could really tell in the movie that he's really hurt over the fact that he was unable to protect Terrell the way that he wanted to, and really struggles to find anyone to open up to. And you can see that that's kind of the catalyst to where he went in life, was just really struggling so deeply inside with what's going on, and feeling like you can't have any way out, or not feeling like there's any hope. So he ends up dropping out of high school, becomes involved with the gangs around the neighborhood, and ends up having 2 children. So thinking from a systems theory perspective, you're really looking at all of those little pieces that play into that. So as far as microsystems go, you're looking at the trauma that Terrell's death has caused and put into Jack's system. And so, we're looking at a potential diagnosis of PTSD, obviously was undiagnosed in the film, but just really seeing that trauma and how that trauma has affected Jack's life in all aspects. So that's affected his school life, because he ends up dropping out of school, not really, I guess, really feeling a purpose in school, or really knowing where to go in that direction, because he's just so deeply affected by the murder of Terrell. And then he's just kind of repeating that family structure that he's seen for so long, and having the children in his teen years and working through that. And so that kind of feeds into his microsystem as well, that you'd really want to pay attention to why that's kind of a cause for a lot of the macro and mesosystems that we're seeing. So then the mesosystems could be the lack of mental health services that Jack's receiving. His mom is not a regular fixture in the home, so she may not even be realizing all of the trouble and hurt that Jack has been going through. And then the mom also has been dealing with drug abuse, which you can then kind of see Jack allude to in the documentary. And that's just kind of the history of how his family has been handling things. And so, without proper mental health services in the schools, Jack is unable to open up to somebody that can really give him the proper treatment and intervention to kind of help him right his way in his own heart and mind to kind of get to the point where he can change in the ways that he wants to as well. And then again, the macro system, you'd be looking at the same location, and that violent neighborhood is the reason for a lot of Jack's, troubles and problems in his systems, is all stemming from that trauma that he's experienced from living there, which sets him up for a lot of repeating of his history that he's noticed. Okay, so when we're looking at the relevance of systems theory today, we're really looking at this holistic approach that still really stands true in our profession. When we're looking back at that history of the 1970s, when this kind of holistic approach really was channeled into social work, and how that effect has really made its mark on our world today. And all of us, I'm sure, is being taught that we're really looking at the whole picture of the person, and the whole person in general, rather than just looking at one type of thing that they may be coming to see us for. So they may be coming to see us for, bad grades, they're struggling in school, but that may lead to a lot of different, revelations that we're finding, that maybe they're struggling in school because they're really tired, because they're taking care of their siblings at home, because their parents both work night jobs or something like that. So what we're really wanting to understand about the client is that there's so many different pieces that are intertwining and affecting their daily life. And so we really need to look at all of those pieces in order to provide the best intervention for them.
Yeah, and kind of going off of what Kennedy said, I personally believe, and I think we all probably believe, that this theory will forever be relevant for social workers. There's always change happening. We're always looking, on a micro level, looking how we can work with our clients and what changes need to happen there. But definitely also looking on a macro level of where, just from this documentary, we can see that policies need to change, because Wanda and Dorothy and Alyssa could never really get beyond that welfare spot. So we always have to look at policies at a whole picture perspective, see all the ways that they're influencing people, not just in the good ways that they're influencing people, but maybe the negative ways that they're also influencing people, and how that change can happen and why that change needs to happen. And so systems change really can't happen without using systems theory and seeing how systems affect people. And it can only really happen when we're looking from the outside in and looking at a whole picture of how a policy is affecting someone.
So then when we're looking at systems theory in our practice, we're really kind of hammering that idea of what barriers are preventing our clients from doing what they want to do. So that was so prevalent in this documentary, of looking at the barriers that were preventing, in Elisa's case, about, she really wanted to get off of welfare desperately, but she couldn't ever get childcare enough to get that other job. Or when she was trying to make it better by getting an education, she then needed the, income, because then she couldn't maybe work while she's doing it, or, those kind of things, just like Sarah was just talking about in policy, like all of those barriers that are related. And then the barriers don't always have to be on a macro level. They can also be on a micro level of, looking at maybe a family member is requiring our client to, babysit or to get a job. And that's kind of feeding on that last example I gave of how that's affecting their school life or something like that. So you really need to pay attention as social workers to the barriers that we find on the meso level, and especially on the micro levels too, of how we can reduce those for our clients.
Okay, and then for the macro level, policy and systems change cannot happen without systems theory. change can only happen when individuals look from outside in to see how the policies and systems are affecting the individual. So again, what Sarah and Kennedy were saying, just making sure that you're looking at every aspect of a person and not just focusing on one or the other, and recognizing that policy and culture and all these big macro level stuff do influence people in their lives, whether it's recognized or not.
Mm. So then for some discussion questions, we wanted to ask what you guys think the relationship between systems theory and policy is. We kind of touched on that quite a bit, but you know, your perspective and your opinion of how does one, you know, do you think one informs the other? Do you think one is more related or more heavily prevalent in the beginning? You know, how do you guys see that relationship between systems theory and policy?
And the second question is, would different systems affect the Collins family if Terrell had not been killed? So if he had not passed away, would there be different systems in place? Would there be systems that are present now that wouldn't be present? So kind of just analyzing that situation a little more and seeing the true effect that Terrell's death had on the family and their systems.
And then here are our references.